Hi, welcome to the channel. Today is day 4 of revising society and social justice. So you have had a chance to revise and read topics every day, and according to the demo schedule I posted, you should be finished with women, globalization and salient features of Indian society. By this schedule you should have revised at least once each of the topic. So what I'm going to do today is just tell you how, when I say that apart from reading it, you should also do the PYQ, but only verbally, not actual write whole of it. So what I'm going to focus today is on the PYQ part. How do you practice or get an idea of what a PYQ requires as an answer, and how to extract that when making notes, as I showed you yesterday. So again, the topics we covered were women, globalization, and salient features of Indian society. I'm going to take a couple of questions from here and show you how briefly you can practice getting a rough idea of what you're supposed to do when framing an answer. If you like that, we can go do that for each question, topic by topic. Now, I don't have an updated PDF. This is still 2023, but for our purposes it will work. Let's take one question from here. The caste one. Why is caste identity in India both fluid and static? Okay, see, one of the first things that you should understand while writing questions, answers, is that something most people don't take into account is the fact that thinking and understanding the question is more important than just writing. If you're able to address all the requirements of the question, that will get you more marks rather than writing a lot of words. So what I say is always allocate at least 30 seconds to read and understand a question before you start answering it. Try to understand the dimensions of it. For example, in this question, the first element is obviously why. Why what? Caste identity. Both fluid and static. Now when somebody asks you why, that reason, they are asking you the reasoning for it. You don't need to argue or present two dimensions, the good or bad or the opposites of the reasoning. You just have to tell me why the reasoning. In this question also, I would not write suggestions. Why? Because they're not required. Maybe you can use some examples, but not way forward and things like that, except maybe in your conclusion. So how will I frame this question and how will I roughly write this question? Why is caste identity in India both fluid and static? So the first thing I will do is start with a quote on caste. Now, as per the studies we did yesterday, you should have a quote or a rough idea or a definition of caste already prepared. If you don't, now you know that is something that is required. I would just try to see if you can find something on caste identity rather than just caste. Any famous quote will do. The second thing is, if you can't find anything, let's say you can't find a quote or you can't think of a quote, the other thing you can do is think of a book or a person who has talked about caste and rephrase them. For example, Ambedkar, obviously famous for caste, you can think of something he said on caste identity. It could be negative, it could be positive, it could be neutral, but something he said about caste can be used here. Or any book you have read, for example, a lot of Premchand's book refer to caste, so you can use that also. Now, first you have written the quote on caste, or an explanation of what is caste identity will also work. If you can't think of anything, just explain what does it mean by caste identity. I would strongly suggest the quote should also try to explain that only, but not the most important way you do it. So you explain caste identity in 3 lines. You can just say that when you strongly identify with certain principle or certain ethnic marker, something like that. Something like that. Then you have explained caste identity. Now you will explain the first part. What does it mean when I say why is it fluid? What does that mean? Fluid means that it can change. So you can show examples of how some castes or some tribal groups got Sanskritized and the castes got upwards. Sociology students have a way better understanding of that, but some of the famous examples you can take. Then the other thing is, why is it static? So the first explanation we will say is that caste is fluid because people or communities have moved up and down, and you will give an example. This is one way to substantiate your answer. Second will be, why is it fluid? Some people have been able to completely completely leave their caste, or as society changes, the strict markers or intermarriages leads to there being fluidity. Then the other is, why is it static? Static one is a bit easier, that there are still rules, there are still problems about the same old thinking is continuing. You can keep up example of purity or something that you have come up with in news. For example, there was some news about Dalit man being beaten up, etc. You can use that. That principles of purity still exist, and they are not allowed to enter certain professions or certain activities. And you can use that example of how things are not changing. No change. Rules are equally strict now. Thinking is still outdated even though laws exist. Things like that you can just use as an example of why it's still static. So now in this question, what you have addressed it, why is caste identity in India both fluid and static? Now the next question appears, then what is the future? Here you can do it in two ways. I would not suggest in such a question to use way forward, because I don't think that works here. I think what works here better is 3 to 4 lines on a positive note, in the sense that with the change in economic and social conditions of society the last 75 years, a lot has been achieved, and yes, a lot has to be achieved as India looks forward to it in Amrit Kal. And then give a positive example. For example, let's say what can be example? Let's say some Dalit person or somebody has given an award, or they have done or you can use a quote again from a book. You can use the example that what manual scavenging has been completely eliminated in India. That's a sign of those outdated caste practices being eliminated. Or you can give an example when you are talking about the conclusion of things that you can incorporate, act like SC/ST Offences Act, laws passed by the government and several judgments have ensured a proper application of laws leading to an upliftment and equality of other castes into the society. So the point being here, what you do, rather than going for a strict, as we are taught, introduction, positive, negative, way forward, maybe a conclusion thing, this is a more theoretical question. So here use a bit more paragraph point rather than points. In the conclusion, you can write 4 to 5 lines showing how certain activities of the society, the government, the policies, etc. have led to a positive development in the society, and conclude it that way. So this was one. Now, this is not all the material that you have on the topic or what all you can use. This was just an example of when you are practicing. As I said, you have read the whole topic. Now you are using the questions to see what material you need. You just think about these things for 2 to 3 minutes. You don't write all of this in an answer. There will be more things that you can think of while writing the paper. What you need to be able to do is understand what more you will be able to extract from the data points that you have read. For example, from this question we got that we need an explanation or a thorough understanding of what is caste identity. We need some examples of both positive and negatives of it, or you can say fluidity and staticness of it. And for conclusion, we need at least one quote on caste. So when you go back and go through the material, this I think was the material, yeah, you can look for things that would have been useful in this answer and highlight accordingly. Let's say where is caste. What you will say is you can need these features. Transformation, the fluidity part we could have used. Affecting change, again in the fluidity part we could have used if they have given any examples. Westernization, fluidity, etc. There is not much in terms of example, so you'll have to come up with them. For example, Sanskritization, we will have to come up with an example of that. Which caste is known to have Sanskritized well, or which tribe has been able to do it and get introduced in the caste system. Westernization, we can give an example of certain food habits that have changed with times, not being limited to caste system, etc. So when you're looking through this material, you can see what else you will need or what else is available to be able to answer such questions. Now let's go to the other question. Let's take something from globalization. Now, globalization, as we have seen, is a big chapter when it comes to reading and revising. But if you see the questions, they are very limited. But that doesn't mean you don't treat it with the same respect it requires in terms of study material, for the simple question that, like society, globalization is something that can be used in a lot of topics. So the data points don't go to waste, because globalization examples get integrated into another topic, like we're thinking of doing it in the caste topic. So from that perspective, the topic is important and treat every subtopic important same way. Now let's see a question. Elucidate the relationship between globalization and new technology in a world of scarce resources with special reference to India. Elucidate. Explain. What do we have to explain? Relationship between globalization and new technology. Okay, in a world of scarce resources. See, this is an expected and easy part. The important point here is that whether you're able to focus on scarce resources and special reference to India. Why? In two respects. Globalization and technology have always gone hand to hand. It is only because technology has advanced that globalization has increased, and then other way around. What they want is the relationship is with reference to two things: how scarcity of resources has an impact on globalization, and secondly, how that impact has affected India. Okay, now this can be a very broad question. What we need to be able to do is also decrease its scope. That special reference to India is something you can address by giving these things in examples as in conclusion. Apart from that, you don't need to worry about it. So that's one part of the question addressed using examples in conclusion. Let's go to the other part of the question, the relationship between globalization and new technology in a world of scarce resources. What they want is explanation. Explanations means give me all the points, all the facets of this relationship. They could be good facets, they could be bad facets. So an easy way to answer it is very simple. You say how globalization and technology has been benefited or has affected scarcity in a good way and bad way. Scarcity in a good way in the sense that as countries have started trade more, things have become easier to transfer from one place to another. We have been able to access resources that were not before accessible to us. It could be food, it could be technology, it could be anything. The bad is, well, there is a huge list of the impact of globalization on environment, on society, on economics, etc. That is the easy way to do it. You explain or give a quote on globalization, you explain the good parts, how tech and globalization have a good effect and a bad effect, and then in examples you give examples of India and conclude on a positive note. Now this isn't very easy way to do it, but here you have a scope to do it in a different way, in the sense you frame it differently. First thing you need to do is able to be come up with a quote on globalization and technology, or just something of an explanation, or you can even use something like, let's say, connected to industrial revolution, that how industrial revolution and globalization have been interconnected and how they have led to increase in trade of goods and services. That would be the first, or the quote part, explanation, quote, whatever you want to call it. The second is that when you elucidate or explain this relationship, you don't use the good or bad, you use the pestle approach, or you just lay down the points. Why I'm saying this? Because this requires you to explore different dimensions. What has been the impact? Now the last thing, when we are saying pestle approach, has to be with terms of scarce resources. Scarcity of resources is the trick part here. How will you include that here? Let's think. In a world of scarce resources. Now this relates to two things. One is overconsumption, and one accessibility. Overconsumption in what sense? There are two ways. One, the fact that when there is a lot of movement of goods, environment gets impacted negatively a lot. The other is that some countries are getting a lot of the benefits and some a lot of the negative. It is not an equality approach. Accessibility, because countries or people who never had access to such resources before are getting those access because of globalization. They're getting those goods because of globalization. So what you will do is, when you're explaining the relationship, See, you can explain it in that way, because resources has to be the central point in which you explain the relationship. So I will start again. You give a quote on it, and then you say how resource consumption has been impacted with the evolution of technology and the spread of globalization. I've said how, obviously you will not use that. You will just say impact on resource consumption with the evolution of technology and spread of globalization, and then start giving points and examples. Here, as I've said, some of the points will be of overconsumption, the resource consumption part, how the environment is being impacted, how certain communities have benefits, and things like that. Now, when you're giving examples, the reference has to be specifically in India. So, how with respect to India, then you give the example, let's say of the environment part. There has been a lot of waste dumping in a lot of third world countries as MNCs have spread. You can use that as an example. Or you can say that a lot of mining etc. has led to an impact on environment. Then Indian environment, and you can use Indian places that have been impacted. The positive is obviously you can say the economic impact has been brilliant for India. So you can use that as a positive of how scarcity has been addressed by import etc. of globalization's impact. You can always use education as an example, especially in an era of Zoom call etc. So the point remains the same, resources, and the examples of them become India, and that's how you address this question. Now let's come to how you will conclude this question. This question, best conclusion would be if you can think of any quote on the benefits of globalization. Anybody has said it. I seem to remember I had learned a quote on how globalization is a monster that, if not controlled, can eat the whole world, something like that. I had an quote which allowed me to explain that while globalization is a good thing, but over reliance on it can lead to issues. So you can use something like that or just explain. What you can also do is, there are a lot of authors who've written on globalization. If you can write 2 or 3 lines from those books, not exact lines, just explain how the author talked about globalization in that book, then you can use that also. That would be a better way to answer this question. Some of this you can find in the study material, some you will have to search for. But what this does is, this 4 to 5 minutes of just spitballing and thinking of what the answer should be will allow you to think of where your study material is lagging and what else you could have added. See, work from home was an expected 2020 question. Local identity is local is something globalization always asks. See, cultural homogenization, but due to this, cultural specificity appear to be strengthened. See, this 2018 and 19 question both require quotes, topics, understanding of local. Same for the 2016 question, aged population. So now if you will see till date, the types of questions that have been asked on globalization can be more or less categorized in 3 parts. One is effect on people. This is part of the syllabus and you need to learn this, and this is the longest of them all. The second is globalization and local impacts. This is a usual question, an expected question that you should be able to answer, so you can prepare for this. The 2022 question of globalization and technology in the world of scarce resources. Now, the benefit of this question is that examples you could have used that you're prepared for these 2. Same for the ending. In this question, the tricky part was framing of the question. If you can frame it properly, the examples and points can be reused. So, if you will see, lots of data points you don't need for this. Data points, I mean that you need to know a lot of quotes, etc. But what you should be able to do is understand the question and then address it. If in this question these 2 points are not properly addressed, the answer is not good. Now let's do a question on women and we will wrap up today's session. We did the suicide one yesterday, so I will not do that one. Constitutional challenges. Continued challenge women in India, like this is a very direct question, can be easily done. Now population control. Now this will be two topics. You should know the women one and the population in both topics. Now this is a good question in the sense this is a topic now also raised. Male membership needs to be encouraged in order to make women's organization free from gender bias. Comment. Comment means that you need to give a concluding answer. What is your opinion or what is your comment on the topic? But before you give a comment, you need to have a balanced view. For you to have a balanced view, you should be able to explain the topic, give both pros and cons on the topic, and then give a proper comment on what you think on the basis of these two things. It can be biased. There is no problem on it being biased. You can go more with the pros or more with the cons in your comment, but you should be able to see the topic from both angles. Excuse me, before you answer that question. Now, how will you answer this question? In such questions, the introduction would be your most interesting point, because if you can think of very interesting introduction, a lot of work is done. Male membership needs to be encouraged in order to make women's organization free. I would start this question, especially because it's a GS1 question, with a very important figure from Indian history who was male and who did a lot for women's causes. For example, I would use Dhundu Keshav Karve, or we can use Jyotibai Phule. We can use any reformer who had a lot of impact on women's rights. We can always use the easiest one, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. It was his action that eventually led to the abolition of sati. So that is something that you can incorporate right in the introduction. It catches your eyes. It will take you only 10 to 20 seconds to think of it, because the answer itself is direct. But if you can make the introduction interesting, you can think of a better, more interesting introduction that can get you some points. Now let's go to the answer. So you could have had a catchy introduction in this answer. Then we'll get to how to address the point. Now in this question, the points itself are not that amazing. The framing of the subtopic is important. Once you've given an introduction, how are you going to use the subtopic, frame the subtopic? Male membership needs to be encouraged in order to make women's organization free from gender bias. So why is male membership important? Not because that will help in making it a bigger cause. The reason for their encouragement is to make it free from gender bias, in the sense that if you will go back to the definition of feminism, it talks about equality, not women's prominence. So if those things get connected, equality of male and female, not predominance of one over the other. If you go by definition, that means male membership in women's organization is important, because only in that way you can have a balanced view of how both genders can work equally. When you have this understanding, you can definitely use it in your introduction, or you can definitely use just what I just said in your conclusion. But the point is, how will you make the subtopic for this? Think about it. Male membership needs to be encouraged in order to make women's organization free from gender bias. So let's talk about bias in women's organization. And then the other point can be how male membership can remove this bias. Or the other way can be, role of male membership in removing bias. Then you go both point. How it can help, can remove bias, cannot remove bias. So it becomes intro. Then this becomes what are the existing bias in women's organization. Third becomes role of male members, which is the question, and in that it becomes two subpoints. Can they remove bias or cannot they? Now here you will give 2 to 3 brief points how they can remove bias. Diversity is always, for example, it provides more diverse opinions. Why it cannot remove bias? Maybe you can say it's not easy to look from their point of view, or maybe they have a privileged point of view when giving advice, something like that. It might be that women might not trust male members' advice, things like that. So you give some point of views here, some point of view here, and then you conclude, in which you address both these things, and you include the fact that a true feminist movement requires equality of the genders, which requires that both work in tandem, which inherently implies that there should be no bias in women organizations, and thus requires male membership. I've said it in a very rough way. You should be able to, when you're just thinking of these things, you should be able to do just that. When you're writing, obviously a bit more polish is required. But what this answer tells you is that in the end, in this whole answer, you didn't need much in terms of other things except a few data points that you can use. Like I used don't do carve, that is something you should be able to come up with. I think if you have read your prelims properly also, you could have come up with some people who could name you could have taken. What this exercise helps you is help you how to form an answer in your mind in 30 seconds to 1 minute, so that when you're giving the paper, you can use this. For example, in this question, the thinking part was not here. The thinking part was a catchy introduction and catchy conclusion. So, target for tomorrow is day 4. So on day 4, you should be able to complete these and start with the 3 topics I told you to read in tandem: communalism, secularism, and regionalism. The benefit is that a lot of these topics are already connected to salient features of Indian society, and you should be able to connect both. Thank you for attending today's session. Let me know if I can help you in any other way. Thank you.